Hi, I'm Nathan Woodhouse, and I'm a doctoral candidate in systematic theology at Boston College. And today I'm with Shawn Copleand, who is Professor Emerita of systematic theology at Boston College. And we're filming a podcast for C21 Center here at BC in the series called The God Pods. And today our topic of conversation is going to be the current context of police brutality and anti-black violence in the United States, race and racism, and the Christian faith. So welcome, and we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Nathan, very much.
So I think something that perhaps would be fruitful to talk about beginning is sort of the context that we find ourselves in. Whenever George Floyd, of course, was murdered by police, that is something that sort of stuck in the heart and the minds of many people in the United States, but also around the world. And of course, not long before that, we had the police murders of Breonna Taylor and others, and as well as the stalking and killing of Ahmaud Arbery, and just outside of part of Atlanta, Georgia. So I think maybe if we could talk a little bit about the situation of racism and violence, that'd be a good place to be.
Yes, it's an awkward place to be.
Yeah, good.
It's a strange place to be. I think we all know that there have been a series of murders or shootings, killings of young black men and middle-aged black men in some form losing their lives to the police for some time now. And this has been intense, certainly since about 2014. And it seems that this particular incident, the death of George Floyd, or better, his murder, because it was captured on film, because someone videotaped it from their phone, recorded it, because there were black and white people standing around this event. It seemed in this way, once it was posted, to capture not just the imaginations, but the hearts of people around the country, and as you said, around the world.
Right.
It's the presence, in the sense, to use Emily Towns's phrase, of this vicious imagination.
Right.
And that we saw someone actually lose their life in front of us. And in some ways, we were all evoked to do something. We were provoked to do something. Right. So this has been really quite a strange time, and many writers have begun to associate this properly, I think, with the experience we're having of the novel coronavirus.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, George Floyd was positive.
Yes, yeah. Yes, and the key symptom being not being able to breathe.
Yeah.
So his last words, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," were they shook people in a way that people, I think, hadn't been shaken before.
Yeah.
I also think, and you can say something to this too, of course, that people have often thought that these men have been provocative to the police, that they've done something, that they're being tracked down because they've got warrants for their arrest, or they're suspects that are very active suspects. And this was not the case in this particular instance. People saw someone not resisting.
Right.
They saw someone in a real way acquiescing to the moves of the police, to the shoving and the pushing and it was shocking, because we don't believe that.
Right.
And so we had to now give credence to the statements that black people have made about unwarranted police violence in particular, but certainly unwarranted violence with the shooting of, as you put it, the stalking and shooting of Ahmaud Arbery.
Right. No, I think it's grotesque, especially to have it on film. It makes me sad that that's the threshold of our compassion.
Yes.
Is that it has to be digitally mediated to us in real time. And even after that, of course, there were people questioning whether or not this stop and this use of force was legitimate, as though you needed to know whether murder on live stream is legitimate or not.
Yes.
Why should we have to question in our heads whether that was a good or a bad or an evil, honestly, thing? And again, you mentioned Dr. Towns, and that's just part of our uninterrogated history that we
Yes.
have
Yes.
of race and racism in the United States.
Yes.
It has become so normalized among us that when we see it, we don't even recognize it.
The police are there to arrest, but they are not there to convict
No.
and to execute. That's
Right.
not their task.
Yes.
And I think the other dimension of that was the face of the officer. I mean,
Right.
it just seemed so indifferent.
It was.
It just seemed so callous.
Mm-hmm.
And this becomes the question, as you point out, about uninterrogated history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it takes us back.
Right.
Even in innocent Minneapolis, we have
Right.
this idea about some parts of the Midwest as
Of
being
course.
innocent and sacrosanct. Not so. Not
No.
the case.
And that's important. So I mean, that does take us back to why are the police the way that they are? How did they become that way? And so I think it's important for us to talk about, especially in this time, the development of the policing of black bodies and of black folks in the United States, and also the development of race and racism. And so I think if we could talk a little bit about the foundations of our nation, that would be helpful, especially. And so what I'm thinking of particularly is the trade in persons from the coast, especially of West Africa,
Yes.
which began much earlier than folks want to admit, or perhaps
Yes.
that they simply don't know.
Yes.
Of course, in 1452 or 1462, I believe, the first enslaved person was stolen from the west coast of Africa and taken to Portugal.
Yes.
So almost 200 years before
Yes.
we would have any brought to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, or the United States.
Yes.
But of course, what people often miss in sort of this switch is that there was no such thing as the white race yet, or the black race
Yes.
yet. That was developed alongside and was concomitant with the development of capitalism
Yes.
and of land grabs from
Yes.
indigenous persons in the United States.
Yes.
And so I think maybe let's talk a little bit about how we came to be in this situation.
Yes, you've thrown out some really important markers
Right.
and points for conversation and for people who are listening to perhaps begin to pursue on their own,
Right.
To deepen their own knowledge. But even if we start at 1619
Right.
and the incredible recognition that 400 years later we find black bodies still being sequestered, policed,
Right.
surveyed, that you can still track down and eliminate black people. This is the case of Ahmaud Arbery in particular, but not solely or exclusively.
No.
So if you think of 1619, these 20 people who are here, who are brought to the United States, you think of what happens. You think of the long history that's intertwined in that long history,
Right.
of course, is the whole issue of indentured servitude.
Yes.
That this country, in fact, like Australia, we had a penal colony in Georgia. We had indentured servants who were able to try to work for someone who had a land grant
Right.
from the monarchy, who then hired these people or brought them over to work the land.
Yes. Yeah.
And that these Africans began in almost the same way.
Yes.
But following, I guess about 30 years or so later,
Right.
we get Bacon's Rebellion,
Right.
and we get the rising of the indentured servants,
Yeah.
because they're denied what was owed to them,
Yes.
because we refuse to pay what we owe. That greed, that vice, becomes a part of
Right.
our sense of capitalism, getting as much as you can.
Right.
And what happens after this, of course, as you know, is that there's a law passed that, in fact, we're going to deal with white indentured servants, but the black indentured servants
Right.
become enslaved forever,
For life.
and the
Right.
child follows the condition of the mother.
Yes.
So that the
Yes.
mother is enslaved, so is the child. Doesn't matter who the father
Right.
is, but in fact, there is this pattern,
Right.
and it continues, and it continues.
Right. And there was almost no precedent for that as well. English common law for a great deal of time followed the civic condition of the father. That had always been the case. until we come to the United States and we recognize a few things. Not only do we need cheap, if not free labor,
Yes.
and do we need a constant supply of it, but
Yes.
after a time we realized that the indentures, people were surviving their indentures.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
so paying them their freedom dues
Yes.
was becoming expensive.
Yes.
And so there were
Yes.
already some chauvinistic attitudes towards people who were not from Northern Europe especially.
Yes.
And so it became easy at the same time to say, what sort of social and political hierarchies can we create to make sure that this labor stays, if not free, then at least very inexpensive, and then how can we perpetuate it?
Yes.
Right.
There's this way in which now we think about, through scholarly work of so many different people, George Yancey, for instance, or we think of Cornel West.
Of course.
There is a sense in which we've made race a social construct.
Yes.
And this stems from this experience
Right.
in the early 17th century, mid 17th century,
Right.
that this artificial epidemiology,
Yes, right.
this epidermis, this skin will now become what it is that we will identify people, how we will identify them.
Right. Difference extrapolated out, and we needed that. We needed something visual to really,
pull us up short.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So there's no, in this sense, to use a sort of an interesting phrase, passing.
Yeah.
So unlike indentured servants who are from, as you said, Europe, these Africans cannot pass.
No, they couldn't.
And so what happens is that, as you pointed out, there is this system that we developed, and
Right.
it moves into a kind of, well, it moves into the plantation system in the sense of having large bodies of land that we have free or cheap labor.
Right.
And even people who did not have workable crops,
Right.
like Massachusetts
Of
right
course.
here, there was slavery in Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
Winthrop's brother-in-law is very disturbed that he finds out there's slave labor in Rhode Island, and so he wants to pick up on it. There's no huge crop for slavery, for anything like slavery,
Right.
in Massachusetts. But for a short time, there was slavery here in Massachusetts. I think the dimension of surveillance that you brought up, this follows from patrollers.
Of course, yeah.
Who were there to ensure that slaves didn't leave the plantation.
Or if they did, these brigades of men,
Yes.
mostly men, almost exclusively
Yes.
men, white men, who didn't know they were white yet,
No.
of course. And so you have these land grants being given to those who had family money, or perhaps those who even, who would ship enslaved persons from West Africa. They were
Yes.
given land grants just for
Merchants.
bringing them.
Yes.
But after Bacon's rebellion, and after in Virginia especially, the failure of tobacco as this monoculture, they realized they're going to have to start diversifying what they were planting. And so they realized that you've got this lower class, so to speak, group of Europeans, of
Yes.
Anglo-Americans, this new group, and deciding, well, we don't want to give them the rights, especially of like college attendance, education, land especially, or politic and civic rights. We don't want to give them that, but we want to keep them on our side.
Exactly.
And so these yeomen essentially get turned into
That's a
this
good way of putting it.
policing force, and they become responsible for maintaining this boundary, which is what Theodore Allen, says they maintain this boundary between who's in and who's out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and when you think about this, there's an identification. There's a psychic identification with the plantation holder,
Yeah.
and the desire to personally somehow advance. So
Yes.
you get the way in which Walter Johnson lines out the various roles and functions in the slave trade.
Yeah.
So the traders and what their role is, the way in which slave auctions operate, the way in which the movement of enslaved people works, and this yeoman class, as you would call them, borrowing an English term,
Right.
really performs a couple of functions. It's the dividing line, but it also is able to have a line of aspiration for a different kind of life and a different kind of future for themselves or their children. I think the other thing that happens here in this movement to understand race is that eventually we find out, and this is part of the franchise and race,
Right.
that you must have property to vote.
Oh, right.
So the franchise in the United States has always been meted out in a very meager and stingy way. Only white men with property voted.
Right.
And then after a while, sometime,
Mm-hmm.
white men voted.
Yeah.
And then after a very long time, black men, some black men got to vote.
Yes.
And finally, we get some changes in the Constitution, some amendments, but we hang on to these people, don't we, in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
And then we finally, in the 20th century, 100 years ago, women get the franchise. So there's a gradual movement
Right.
here of meagerly,
Yeah.
meanly handing out political rights,
Right.
handing out political rights.
Which seems like a knock in the face to what freedom is
Exactly.
meant to mean.
Meant
And
to mean.
so what this brings up for me is perhaps we focused a lot on racism and its development and how racism created race, and how there is no thing in space and time that you can point to and say that is a race, or there are racial groups, and if they would just talk and get along, no, this is an invention, this is a means to social control, that racism operates this way. But so we could focus for a long time on that, but instead of doing that, I think let's focus on forms of resistance. And especially, I know that you have read and written especially extensively on forms of religious resistance that enslaved persons found themselves not only capable of, but quite creative with. So if you could, let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Slave resistance is it's an incredible phenomenon, and what it reflects back in a great universal way is the power of the human spirit.
Right.
Not to be beaten down, not to just embrace its denigration,
Right.
but to push against it. And so enslaved people did this in many ways. They did this surreptitiously by learning to read and write, by listening in on the lessons of little white children as their parents might have taught them to read. They found themselves able to certainly, and first of all, escape, to run away, to find patterns and ways to signal to one another when the time was right, So we have situations like we see in the wonderful movie Harriet, which is drawn from her own experience of freeing enslaved people, leading them to freedom seriously. We also have people who find freedom in religion, and religion becomes a great font and source. Which steels, S-T-E-E-L-S, steels them against the kind of bone and soul crushing experience that slavery was.
Yeah.
So in this way, if we start to talk about the development of what we know as the historic black church, it begins not by being exhausted by Christianity, but by a kind of fusing and a kind of blending of African experiences of the holy. And those are culturally varied, because we all know that no one who was kidnapped and sold was an African, put that word in quotes. They all belong to different linguistic cultural groups. They were Ewe, they were Bini, they were Ibu, they were Yoruba. And they bring with themselves their own culture and their own religious aspirations and rituals. And you try to replicate some of that in this new place. Yeah. And so Albert Raboteau, one of the first book on the invisible institution, he calls slave religion, the religion of the enslaved people. And what he traces out, of course, is the way in which these people went off at night and hid in little valleys or little copse of trees, and sang and prayed, or they sat in their cabins.
Yeah, the hush harbors.
Yes, they sat in their cabins, and they sang and prayed. And what did they pray for? Most often they prayed for freedom. Yeah. And the thing that has always struck me tremendously in slave narratives is to read about people who are praying for freedom, but who say, if we don't see it, let our children see it. So there's an enormous sort of generosity and desire to find a future life for their children and their children's children.
Right.
So religion becomes then a very steady resource. Someone like Gary Rod Wilmore in his Religion and Black Radicalism, Black Religion and Black Radicalism,
Right.
is clear to remind us that Christianity does not exhaust black religion.
No.
That there is so much more there that we don't even know, and that scholars are beginning to take apart now
Right.
to find practices and rituals
Right.
that stem from African experiences.
Right.
The other point is that when you read about the spirituals, people will say that the words we made up, that we had
Yes.
an experience and we
Yeah.
reflected on that experience and we sang about it.
Right.
But the tunes came from the melodies, came from our great granddaddies from Africa.
Right.
So
right.
there's an ongoing connection. There's an ongoing connection.
Yeah. There's so much there that reminds me of what Tracy Hucks calls, multiple religious allegiance.
Yes.
People have all of these different fires kindled everywhere, and sometimes they would build up, two fires together, but they've kept them burning singularly as well at the same time. And I mean, it's just fantastic because, not only is this what we think of as perhaps typically religious and worshipful styles, but these are also very practical forms of religion from from especially the west coast of Africa. Roboto also mentions that when we hear narratives of enslaved persons who resisted overbearing overseers and slave masters as well, we try to put it in common ethical terms, maybe of good and evil, but he says, no, this is just a matter of survival.
Yes.
This is what this is. And so, fighting someone or running away, which has more of an even psychic element to it, running away did. But also even of using perhaps what we would think of as nefarious means of poisoning someone or of having to use violence, as much as we want to disdain it and avoid it at all costs. These folks were not asking questions about good and evil, but am I going to wake up tomorrow? And if I don't, will it be all right?
Yes.
Right. And this is the future aspect.
Well, you're thinking perhaps about the Stono rebellions, which were the fiercest and most violent slave rebellions. Historians would tell us that, in fact, there were many more rebellions than we know because no one wrote about them.
Of course.
It would be too dangerous
Bad
and
optics.
too unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Even then.
Of course.
Even then.
Of course.
Even then. The other, just to make one last point about this, is hiding. And we get the famous story of Linda Brent or Harriet Jacobs.
Yes.
Who in fact is buried in the Mount Auburn Cemetery.
Right,
here.
right.
She hid in a garret
Yeah.
for years, evading, to use a 19th century word, lecherous and perverted slaveholder
Yeah.
who was himself a physician and a member of the United States Congress.
Unsurprisingly.
Yes, there are any number of incredible stories. Henry Box Brown, who nails himself somehow. He gets a generous and collaborative white person to put him in a box and to mail him to freedom. The Crafts, this couple who in fact pose, she as a young white man and he as her body servant.
Right.
They find themselves in this situation and they get out. They get out of slavery.
Right.
So there are many different ways that people worked to do that, and religion becomes a sustaining dimension to that.
And so you mentioned the Black Church, so I think we could talk a little bit more contemporaneously about what the Black Church means and what function that it serves, but not also the Black Church, but Black theology as well. And so what this reminds me of is something that Professor Ebony Marshall Terman says, is that the Black Church doesn't exist because it wants to, but because it must.
Yes.
Because it needs to, as a site of survival and as a site of respite from a world generally, but more specifically a United States that perpetuates white supremacy and its spaces and its practices and its traditions and protects whiteness as this sacred object that is obviously very well guarded by people who police in more metaphorical terms, but also very obviously physically as well. So let's talk about Black theology as a development of these creative forms of resistance.
Well, we could say that Black theology certainly existentially begins really in pain and in joy. So there's already, if you like, a kind of blues aesthetic surrounding Black theology. But at the same time, it begins in the recognition of a number of pastors and young theologians in 1968, 69, 66, 67,
course,
68,
with the Detroit
69.
riots.
Yes, exactly. These people, these men, really, begin to raise a number of questions about the meaningfulness of their theological education to the situation in which they found themselves.
Right.
And so someone like, for instance, Albert Clegg, who begins in Detroit, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, who does really an aesthetic makeover. There's a Black Mary, there's a Black Jesus.
Right.
And then you have, this is already around 67, but then in 1968 we recognize the tragic and brutal assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which galvanizes the African American community. It galvanizes the Black community. And it galvanizes the nation because there's just eruptions everywhere.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens, of course, is that early on in April of that year, within that week, the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, Black Catholic priests are meeting, and they develop a manifesto in which they identify the Catholic Church as a white racist institution. And its completeness in the way in which you describe the way in which Christianity has protected whiteness here in the United States, certainly.
Oh, yeah.
But there's also a young theologian, James Hal Cone, who is out in Adrian, Michigan, about 70 miles from Detroit. And he's furious because he sees the failure of his education to meet this crisis. And so what does he do? He goes home to Arkansas, and he goes to his brother's church, and he locks himself in his brother's office. His brother gives it over to him, and he writes. He writes every day. He just stays there. He writes and he writes and he writes, and he comes up with what is a very robust. It's an angry polemic.
It is.
Black theology and Black power.
It is.
And what he wants to say to us is that the gospel of Jesus Christ is Black power.
Yes.
It's consonant with Black power. It teaches us in that gospel about the dignity of every human person. It teaches us about the need to have people's, to use this phrase, vital needs met.
Right.
It teaches us about respect. And it teaches us to love the neighbor.
Right.
So what Cone does is he takes that gospel and he reads it directly through the Black experience. And he finds Jesus. Jesus is God's Black warrior come to the oppressed. So this is really perhaps the first person he is to use the phrase Black theology in writing, and certainly in sustained writing.
Yes. Right.
So this book is one that continues to challenge Black and white people, because he says white people can't be saved.
Right.
Well, you can't be saved, he says, not because you're white, but because you won't take on the experience of Blackness. Yeah. That you won't, to put it in different terms, you won't befriend, be neighbor. Yeah. You won't be compassionate and loving to another human being who just happens to be Black.
Right. Yeah. I think when I think of that work especially, I do hear a lot of Dr. Cone's anger, and that's what a lot of people read whenever they read that. But there was so much to just be so righteously angry about,
of course,
at the time. And I think what's most sad is I think that was published very end of 67 and early then into 68. I think what's so sad is that when I heard him speak years later, 2016, 2017, I think at one of my alma maters, there had been a noose found on campus recently. And, here we are, well into the 21st century, and he was still angry, and why shouldn't he have been?
He should be
still angry about this, because still there is this inability, to have compassion or to see past things that are just beyond the tip of our own nose, to be
Yes.
so selfish,
Yes.
which is unfortunately, I think, what we
Yes.
see a lot of
Yes.
still today. But of course, Dr. Cohn had many students,
Yes.
and many of them who were very fond of him and
Yes.
loving towards him. But I think perhaps one of the most profound works that was written after him was Kelly Brown Douglas's The Black Christ.
Yes.
And she produced this amazing piece of scholarship that said, absolutely there must be this identification of Christ as black, not only existentially in an experience, and perhaps not also, if not a bit ethnically. We need to talk about the fact that Jesus does not have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yes.
He's not 6 feet tall and has
Yes.
2.3 children.
Yes.
But that he was a Palestinian Jew who
Yes.
lived in empire. And so his experience for the United States is the black experience
Yes.
in the United States, but something that she was very careful to point out, and not only her, of course, Dolores Williams as well, and others, was that we have overlooked black women.
Yes.
And that we constantly overlook
Yes.
them, that we read
Yes.
past them.
Yes.
And we do it every single day. And of course, this is where your own work picks up. And so I think we should we should give some good time to speaking about that, to the womanist tradition and how it developed.
Yes. Black women found themselves between, but a part of, two different trajectories of critique. There is the racial critique in the United States, and there is also the feminist critique. So I mentioned earlier women only in 1920 in the United States. I mean, they're voting in New Zealand really in the late 19th century, but not here.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have black women in between. And so Frances Beale,
Right.
many, many years ago, one of the first who talked about the triple jeopardy of black women: gender, race, and class. So, because at that time, of course, we'd begun the kind of feminization of poverty.
Right.
That poverty was about women, and it was about a certain kind of woman, and usually that woman was black. And we get from our presidential leadership at that time this kind of magnification and this kind of negative depiction of black women. And womanist theology really emerges to provide not simply a counter, but a counter to the absence of black women. It's a wonderful phrase used by Anna Julia Cooper: "When and where I enter, the whole race enters with me." So black women who give life to female and male children.
Right.
Where black women are, everyone is. The whole race comes with them, she says. So there is a defined critique. This phrase "womanist" comes from a book by Alice Walker, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, in which she defines the word womanish. She's using as a comparative the phrase mannish,
Right.
which is an old Southern term. You're from the South.
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard it from
I've
somewhere.
heard it, yes.
So this phrase "womanish," stop acting like you're grown.
You're grown.
Don't be so womanish. Or mannish. You don't have long pants yet. So there's a way that she captures this, and she makes it a positive definition.
Right.
She says that you are bold, you are fierce, that you are capable, that you are strong, that you are loving, that you are intelligent.
Right.
To go back to Harriet, she has a wonderful line there when she says, can I take people to freedom? The little girl asks, and the mother says yes, and it won't be the first time. So there are ways in which this phrase begins to function as a lens for critique, and so it provides a touchstone.
Right.
Doesn't exhaust, but it provides a touchstone.
Right.
And so you have incredible people like Katie Geneva Cannon, the late Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who died almost 3 years ago now. Her work, which really gave us a kind of black womanist ethics,
Yes.
or the work of Dolores Williams, Sisters in the Wilderness.
Making a way out of no way.
Exactly. Or someone like Dr. Emily Towns. We
Right.
mentioned Dr. Jacqueline Grant, we can mention. They're a line of ongoing writers and thinkers who embody that spirit to provide a critique of the experience of black women
Right.
in the United States.
Right.
So, Enfleshing Freedom, which is the book perhaps we're thinking of right now, of my own, tries to demonstrate how black women continue the effort to enflesh freedom. Doesn't exhaust anyone else's efforts, but it pays attention to the work of black women, and it pays attention to the way in which their bodies have been used throughout these 300 years, 400 years of slavery as for production, for reproduction, for all sorts of labor. And there is a sense in which these women are struggling, really, but it's not as if it's, oh, poor me. There's a lot of joy in that struggle. And there's also a lot of faith in future possibilities. And there's a lot of faith in the transcendent, in the divine. So these efforts, and really my own effort, I could say, is an attempt to also deal with the issue of a black Catholic theology that addresses these kinds of concerns.
And so what that, I think, reminds me of, especially as at a event here around Boston that I was at, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas came to speak, and she spoke at length on her work, Stand Your Ground, which she wrote about American exceptionalism, especially white exceptionalism, and whiteness as this sacred object that is perpetuated and it's protected. It's protected legally and it's protected socially and politically, of course, and it definitely creates a boundary into which people want to prevent penetration. Of course, police are one way that is policed. That is one way that it is protected. But something that she also said that stood out to me when we were listening to her speak is that she said that white folks don't have to be white. And so our initial way that we've been conditioned to listen is to think, oh no, but I have white skin. I have to be. Maybe you're not sure, but of course she meant something much more profound than skin colored. And so that is something that really hit me hard. And that was in my first year of my time in Boston, and now moving into my fourth, it's still something that lingers with me, but it's also something that I've tried to take seriously and ask myself, obviously she didn't mean skin color. Okay, so if white folks don't have to be white, what does that mean? And of course it means a number of things, and it's at an intersection of so many things. It means becoming uncomfortable. It means relinquishing privilege. It means choosing to identify with the oppressed in some way, and it's not going to be in an easy way. There are many forms of appropriation that can occur that would be ugly and inappropriate, and so it's difficult to find ways to resist without appropriation. It's also difficult to overcome what is rightfully so much antipathy from black folks, especially in the United States, for how good, seemingly well-meaning white folks want to participate, but especially white Christians who are beginning to ask themselves, it seems as though that this white supremacist, anti-black, racist country that I live in, that I participate in, I want to give up what it means to participate in this. And so what can we do? And so I know you and I both are very fond of the late German Catholic theologian Johann Baptist Metz, and especially his concept of dangerous memory and of narrative and of solidarity. And so I think if we could talk a little bit about that, maybe we could perhaps give folks some means in their everyday lives to have what he called an apocalyptic consciousness, to see things not as they are, but as how they could be unveiled.
I think to go back to the death of George Floyd, as that kind of moment. And there is, as we know, the incredible phrase in Scripture, unless the grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, there's no harvest.
Right.
And there is happening now a very strange harvest when you think of this in the 401st year of people of African descent being brought to the United States. Not belonging, but being brought. Not ever finding a place of belonging, really. But so many people have died, and it seems as if this death has been for the country a kind of tipping point. And what is being harvested are, in fact, a number of movements, not only Black Lives Matter,
Of course.
taking a lead and providing nonviolent resistance, but the work of Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris in the Poor People's Campaign. Also, I think when I see young white people marching, what I think is that these must be people who are benefiting, in fact, from knowledge received through ethnic studies programs, through Black studies, through African American studies, African studies, feminist studies, Chicano studies, Latinx studies, that Asian American studies, all of these ethnic and area studies, as they're called in so many different universities, have given them some knowledge of the positivity of difference.
Right.
And so what I'm praying for, of course, is that they will continue. Charles Blow had a article in the Times a few days ago. Don't fail us, white allies, don't stop.
Yeah.
And so what that means is to remember that, let that memory trigger in others a feeling of critical self-examination.
Yes.
Of what it means to be human. I mean, when I think Douglas says white people don't have to be white, it means that you don't have to be anti-human.
Yeah.
You don't have to be stuck in some really negative, sinful pattern that is individualistic to the point of turning yourself into an idol. We have too many examples of that all around us. I think it also means learning to befriend someone, to take a risk, and to put yourself in the way of that.
Yeah.
To put yourself in the way of connecting with a classmate, of connecting with someone in a store.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking simple things right now, just
Yes.
simple human
Yeah.
simple human things. It's someone wrote there was a article in the paper the other day about how all of these gestures by corporations, everyone is affirming Black Lives Matter. What does that really mean?
Right.
I mean, are we doing it because it'll increase sales?
Of course.
You know, I was afraid of the Juneteenth celebration. I thought suddenly Hallmark is going to put out a Juneteenth card, you know.
And movie.
Just like Sears took over dashikis in the 60s.
Right.
I mean, there are ways in which these things become commercialized to a point that they have no meaning whatsoever.
Yes. Right.
And so I think that's part of what you're getting at in terms of inappropriate appropriation.
Right.
That finding out how we can be supportive to one another without taking over one another's cultures or cultural artifacts or cultural mores. But it also means admitting that American culture is fundamentally African American culture.
Yeah.
It's our music that's out there.
That's right.
It's our swagger, if
And
you
dance.
like, and dance that's out there. It also means finding, I think, unity around justice. So the Charlottesville event to say the Jews will not replace us, it raises up the whole horrible specter of increasing anti-Semitism here. And it should make us, it should wake us.
Yeah.
It should wake us. The Metz and so many others in Germany during that time, Bonhoeffer, Pastor Niemöller, were all alert to the need for identification with the so-called other.
Right.
Because on a purely self-interest basis, when there's no one left to get, they're going to get me, Niemöller says. They came for the communists, I didn't say anything.
Right.
They came for the tradespeople, I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
They came for the Roma people, I didn't say anything.
And now they're coming for peaceful protesters.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Then they came for me.
Yep.
One of the key things that Cohn points out is silence. So white people have to let go of silence.
Yeah. It's a privilege.
Yes,
Yeah.
hiding behind I didn't know. I think the presence of young white people in these new movements is saying, yes, you do know.
Yeah.
And you can learn, you can find out.
Right. And this is that apocalyptic, the mysticism of open eyes.
Yes.
that Metz wanted folks to have. I mean, and geared towards solidarity, but in the form of compassion.
Yes.
A form of being able to recognize what whiteness is, which is not easy. You don't realize it's almost a null value that you get to participate in without realizing what doors it opens,
Yes.
literally and metaphorically.
Yes.
And so it's difficult, and Metz suggests operating with this dangerous memory, but he refers to the authority of the suffering.
Yes.
Of that is what should be at the forefront of our mind, is that especially when it comes to political participation and using, if you can say this, your religious beliefs and praxis in a way that is very concrete in the world. Part of what that is going to mean is deferring to the authority of the suffering.
Yes.
And so there should be action, and there should be movement and participation and risk, even in certain ways, and putting your body in the way of doing things like that. But it also means deferring to folks and knowing when to listen and not to speak. There's been lots of speaking been done for the last 400 some odd years in this nation by white folks. And so part of this is going to be learning how to not only to recognize, but to offer when it is appropriate to validate the authority of the suffering. And here that's going to mean trans persons and black folks and the
gay and lesbian
folks
queer
and
folks.
Indigenous folks and queer folks here. And that's difficult because it makes, I think, white folks feel like they're losing something, but there's so much to gain. There's only gain after all of this. And I know it seems like it's going to be difficult, but having your eyes open and seeing something new for the first time is shocking. But it is never, I don't think, in the long term, a bad thing.
No. And putting your body on the line. I mean, there have been examples in the last decade. I mean, think of the mothers who were standing in front of protesters just the other day out in Oregon.
Getting tear gassed.
Yes. Think of the Army veterans who came to the pipeline a few years ago, who stood with Indigenous people in protest against the pipeline. And you knew that no one was going to shoot a veteran. You just knew it. But what a powerful image that became. And what a powerful moment of reconciliation that happened between the Army, those armed forces, and the Indigenous people, those warriors. A real opportunity that people took and couldn't move from. Or think of right now, we've been perhaps not aware of what's happening in Indigenous communities. The Irish from Ireland have been sending money to the Navajo. I mean, because the Navajo sent money to the Irish during the famine. It's almost unbelievable. But it's the power really of compassion that you're talking about. And compassion is cognitive. You have to know something. It's affective. You've got to feel something, but it's moral. You have to act on what you know and feel. It can't be empty. And in this way, Christianity provides, I think, an opportunity for us, because we've used it to oppress people. We can also use it, as we've learned in black theology, to liberate people, as we've learned in feminist theology, to liberate people, in Latin American liberation theology. That's what that's about. So your point about, just going back to this issue of being white, yes, it's to be aware. It's an old article, Peggy McIntosh, my knapsack of privileges. You unpack those. That's a key thing. Here at Boston College, we try to do that with students, particularly in the Pulse program, to teach them that, in fact, there are other people out there who are just like them. They just happen to have, that old thing that Machiavelli talks about, luck. They had bad luck. Fortune didn't smile on them. Maybe they made some good choices, but luck didn't push it forward. And so it's helping young people be aware of what's happening in the world in which I live, and what do I get in this world that I didn't earn. And we don't ever earn anything when you think about the world. We didn't earn these buildings. We didn't build them, but we used them.
And I think that's what this brings me back to George Floyd, is that no one earns the breath that they take into their bodies, but it can be taken away, and it is taken away every single day. by police,
Yes.
by people who see themselves as judge, jury, and executioner there in that moment. And so I think that if we realize that it's not just, that's not luck, there are social goods, there's social forms of equality that we
Yes.
should want for all people. You know, the term that's gone out of favor, the common good, of wanting what's good for everyone.
Yes.
That's difficult whenever we have commodified greed, whenever
Yes.
it's a good.
Yes.
We make television shows about it.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
we form entire institutions
Yes.
around it. And so I think if folks can look and see, something else that Matt said is that there's no suffering that does not concern us.
Yes.
You know, so whether it's the Irish caring about the Navajo, or about aid that we send to other parts of the world, it's good to look and to realize that not only is there poverty and is there hunger, but there's also resistance and there's also
Yes.
creativity
Yes.
that we must pay attention to. But there are
Yes.
also structures, including policing, that need to that need to be checked.
And evaluated.
Yeah.
So the cry, defund the police,
and
does
held
not
accountable.
mean get rid of the police.
Mm.
It means think about how we've asked the police to do too much,
Yeah.
and think about how we allocate social services.
Right.
So I think the burden here for us in terms of the Catholic tradition, and you brought up the common good, and so I want to give a plug for one other person, and that is for Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, who has had his eye, I think, on the common good. Not using that phrase, but there's all about trying to figure out how we're unified.
Right.
I mean, he says, New York, we're tough, we're smart, we're disciplined, and we're unified.
Right.
We've got to be unified so that everything that affects one of us affects all of us.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that's very tragic that we've learned from going through this experience of the coronavirus at this time. I think that that's one way, perhaps, to kind of round us out. I mean, the common good. That's something that we try to teach students here. And it's also something that Boston College is struggling to learn.
Yeah.
Not only the common good right here, right now in our own little bailiwick, but our larger contribution to the larger world.
And to look at it with open eyes.
Yes.
Well, thanks for joining me today, as I know it was a privilege for me. And thank you, everyone who chose to watch and to listen. We hope that this has been fruitful.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me, because it's always a pleasure to talk to one of your ace students. And so thank you all for tuning in, listening.
Thank you.